here.
Better to be quiet.
Basically telling
Good morning, folks. So welcome. We're glad to have you here for the next in our so-called cybersecurity speaker series. So we're really privileged today to have Ido Saban-Sevilla joining us from Cornell Tech, where he's currently a postdoctoral researcher with Helen Nissenbaum and folks in her lab. So previously, he was at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, Israel, and was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Minnesota for his master's before then.
Yep.
We're very eager to hear what he has to tell us today on some comparative research on national security policies. Ido, thank you.
Thank you. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So, thank you for this opportunity. So, a little bit about myself. My background brings together technical experience and defensive and offensive cybersecurity with academic training in public policy and political science. And my goal as a researcher is to understand how risk governance framework for cybersecurity are designed. And the overarching argument in my research so far is that some of the cyber insecurity out there is due to the way policymakers construct these risk governance frameworks. I'm arguing that these frameworks are constrained by early institutional design choices and historical decisions that really limit cybersecurity risk governance framework from utilizing their potential and promoting, so to speak, the public interest. And I'll try to demonstrate that through two case studies, one in the EU and the second is on the US. So our agenda for today, I will share with you my research narrative. We then go through the two case study. The first is about how the EU uses certificates as a tool of governance to govern for cybersecurity and devices. For instance, if I want to know that my mobile phone is secure, I'm going to certify it and label it as a secure mobile phone through a certain evaluation process. So this will be more of a deep dive into this case of using certificates in the EU. The second case study about US federal policymaking regarding cybersecurity. This will be a more broad overview of this case and how the US goes about governing cybersecurity in the private sector. I will conclude by presenting takeaways from both of these cases and end with sharing with you some of my current and future research steps that are related to this project. So in my research narrative, I'm interested in two puzzles. How policy arenas, policy processes, different institutional settings mediate governance outputs, create public policy outputs. So this is more of an empirical puzzle, how this is happening. Secondly, I'm trying to explain what I found. So more of a theoretical question. What explains the way these policies are designed? How can we explain policy change or policy stagnation in coping with risks from digital technologies? So I live kind of in the intersection between digital technologies and risk governance. I'm studying cybersecurity risks. This will be this talk. I'm also studying privacy risks under this umbrella. The methods that I use, so I'm using inductive and deductive text analysis of policy documents to understand how we got to this point. And I'm also using the process tracing methodology. So I'm analyzing documents and interview transcripts to uncover the causal mechanism that brought us to this point, that brought us to the way policies are designed to govern those issues. And I'm doing so through two case studies. One in the EU, this is a paper that is currently under review about how the EU deals with risks in devices, IoT cybersecurity risks. And the second one is on the US, so how the US is dealing with private sector cybersecurity risks. And this paper was published in the Journal of Risk Research. Okay, let's dive into our first case study. So we have the panel up there to kind of guide us through this case. So I'll start with some background. So in 2017, the FDA issued a recall for pacemakers made by Abbott Laboratory. The agency found a way for hackers to take over those pacemakers control the pace that they produce, and deplete the battery of the devices. And imagine roughly 800,000 patients had to go to their doctor and get a security patch for their pacemaker. And this is why, it's just one example, why the security of devices is becoming such a big thing. The EU is trying to use certificates to cope with that. So the EU is trying to certify products for security, but I'm asking, okay, what exactly is a certification regime? What does it include? So first we have the standardization bodies. These are the bodies who set the rules. Think of ISO, for example. Then we have the certification bodies. These are the bodies who evaluate products according to those rules. Then we have the simultaneous use evaluation laboratories to do the actual testing. And we have a fourth independent accreditation body to monitor the quality of the certifiers. So there you have it, a chain of independent actors with the sole purpose of increasing the trust of us consumers in the devices that we use. And I'm arguing that it's important to study certification first because it injects private expertise into the governance process. This is often private bodies who are expert in certifying devices. And secondly, we need to understand how these certification frameworks are embedded. Are they closer to the market, under the shadow of the market, closer to the manufacturers they aim to certify, or are they close to the state and national agencies and work according to their constraints? So how they actually operate. So the trigger for asking this question is the recently created cybersecurity certification framework in the EU. And these are the two questions that I'm asking. So first, how and to what extent the cybersecurity certification regime has been integrated in the EU. And when I'm saying EU integration, I mean that policymaking is happening now at the EU level rather than at the national level. So to what extent the use of certificate is mandated by the EU. And I'm tracing that over the past 22 years until the recently agreed Cybersecurity Act. So this is an empirical question. And then I'm trying to explain that. So what explains the post-integration policy design that we see in each of the different certification regime components that we went through before? And the essence of the research puzzle here is the fact that cybersecurity certification is kind of in between two models of EU policymaking. If you look at the academic literature of how EU policymaking is being done, it kind of reflects a dichotomous understanding. So EU policies either follow a market integration process. So think about the EU is trying to harmonize standards for everybody, control how organic products will be produced. This is a classic market integration to remove trade barriers and even the playing field for everybody. And we expect there a more of a supranational EU level policy regime. So things will be smoothly decided by the EU for everybody. But the EU is doing actually more than that. The EU is also trying to do core state power integration. The EU is trying to get involved in issues that are close to state sovereignty. Think about the immigration crisis in the EU. The EU is trying to control what's happening in the borders of member states. This is much a condensed type of EU policymaking. And I'm arguing that cybersecurity certification is kind of in between those two. We're creating a market for certified products, harmonizing requirements for everybody, but at the same time, we're trying to mobilize the way nation state decides what gets certified, decide what standards will be used, and we expect a lot of opposition by nation state to do so. And this is the puzzle. What kind of policy regime, what kind of policy design should we expect after the EU is taking over? And to explain policies at this level, I'm using classic theories of EU integration, classic theories of EU policymaking. So my first hypothesis to explain that will be that we're expecting the policy to be very functional to the problems, right? So the certification regime can be explained by functional spillovers from previous integration attempts in the EU. The market is very, very fragmented. For instance, if I was certified in Germany, and I want to work in France, I have to be certified by French authorities as well. And it goes on. So there's a lot of fragmentation in that market, and it's heavy regulatory burden. I expect industry lobbies to push for harmonizing the requirements for everybody and solving this functional problem in the regime. So I'm expecting a very efficient public policy, a very efficient policy regime in this case. There are also cybersecurity problems in the way we certify our product. These are lengthy processes, very costly, and I expect the policy regime to kind of work through that and make it a much more efficient process that suits the dynamic life cycle of connected products. So two functional problems that are in place that I expect the new regime to be solved. So this hypothesis leads us to expect an efficient regime to be designed by the EU. The second hypothesis looks at it from a different angle. It looks at the EU as a political actor. The EU is trying to maximize its political power and influence in this policy space, despite reluctance from member states, creating what we call a supranational policy regime, giving more authority to EU institutions. So the glasses that we use here is of the EU as a political actor, trying to push for more and more influence. I'm expecting the EU to try to utilize the fragmentation in the market to be more influential. And we know from the literature that certification is already a tool for the EU to bypass member states. Right? Think of the EU as an international organization. It really tries to use standards body at the international level to directly govern what's happening in industries in member states, kind of bypassing member states through these standardization bodies. So I expect the EU to be a political actor here as well. A third type of glasses to look at this problem is to look at what powerful state is doing it, arguing that, wait a minute, the regime that will happen is a regime that is instrumentally designed by member states to increase their influence, increase their legitimacy in the process. So a very different expectation on what kind of a regime we see. I'm expecting not a European regime, but a very nationally controlled regime where member states get to decide how certificates will actually be used in the EU. We know that France, Germany, the UK, they're already heavily invested in certification frameworks, so I expect them to design policies that preserve and further legitimize their influence. So overall, we have three very different expectations, very different hypotheses to explain our theoretical question. How did we get to this point? How come the EU is using certificates in this way? Okay, a little bit about my methodology. So I collected 41 policy documents and reports from EU institutions, from private stakeholders, from the European Network and Information Security Agency, and I interviewed 18 key stakeholders with an average duration of interview roughly 50 minutes. I talked to representatives from EU institutions, from national agencies, from certification bodies, and from the industry, with the goal of uncovering what were the drivers, what led to policy change in using certificates in the EU. I'm going to summarize the results in two figures. So on the left-hand side, you can see the different components of what is a certification regime. Remember, we talked about this in the first slide. You can see here standardization, accreditation, certification, and evaluation. These are all components in certifying products. And we're going to see how member state and private actors interact and create governance frameworks using certificates. So currently, before the recently agreed act, we have 4 ways to get a security certificate for your product. The first is an international route. Standards are decided based on what's called common criteria agreements. These are internationally recognized certificates. So if I'm a manufacturer of pacemakers and I want my security certificate to be internationally recognized, I will go to this route and be certified by a national cyber agency with intelligence and defense agencies are doing the accreditation. So this is a very nationally oriented path to get a certificate that's recognized at the international level. In 1997, the first attempt to make it a more European framework took place, but it ended up to be a very political way of dealing with certificates. Powerful member states were stronger than others, and they dictated, again, a very national certification path. So national agencies are the ones who certify, intelligence agencies are the ones who accredit, and actually very few products were actually certified based on this path. And a nation state responded and created their own standards that are recognized only within their own boundaries. And this created the large fragmentation that we currently see in the market. So again, national agencies certified, national accreditation bodies accredit them, but everything was heavily skewed through national decision-making over how certificates will be produced. And the private sector responded and created a fourth, very private path of working with certificates. We see here, for the first time, private certification bodies. So you're going to be certified by a private entity for the first time. And one of the things that we will see that the EU is trying to do is kind of elevate these private certifiers to certify on behalf of the EU rather than for private purposes. So this is the current regime. So you see 4 paths for certification that are operating. So what's happening in the emerging regime? Oh, and just let's label each of the regime components. So standards are happening at the intergovernmental or national level, and accreditation and certification is happening at the national level, like we said. The emerging regime, again, we see the 4 components of what is a certification, and for the first time we see EU bodies getting involved in this process. So 3 paths for certification in addition to the 4 paths we just saw for high, substantial, and low assurance levels for your device. Standards are facilitated by EU bodies, the Commission and ENISA, with inputs from stakeholders and National Cyber Agency. They decide what will be produced as a certification scheme. Are we going to certify phones at the European level? Or are we going to certify pacemakers? Are we going to certify home appliances? What that will be. This is where the decision is being made. Accreditation is, again, it's happening at the national level, but it's mutually recognized across member states. And one of the things that member states were able to incorporate in this policy is the peer review mechanism for accreditation. So think about it. If I'm in Germany, I do not want products that were certified in Romania in maybe less rigorous standards to be valid in Germany. So member states created kind of a peer review mechanism to control how every state certifies and to ensure that the quality of certification is high enough according to national way of doing certificates. Certification is happening for the first time by private bodies who can certify on behalf of the EU. So we have the national agencies, but we also have private bodies for certification. And for the first time, an industry self-assessment. So a manufacturer can certify itself for the first time based on low assurance to provide a low assurance level for its device. Evaluation is done by private labs, and at the end of this process, you get an EU-labeled certificate for your product. If we label the different regime components, so we see that standardization became supranational, and accreditation and certification for the first time is recognized across member states. So I'm being certified in Slovenia, but I'm being recognized in Germany. This is a huge change in this regime. So on paper it looks good, but when you look deep into the interactions, you see a lot of national control on all of these patterns. And this kind of really questions to what extent the new regime is actually new. It actually changed from the old regime. You see that member states can actually decide what will be decided in the certification scheme. There's the peer review mechanism that we talked about to allow them to control what's happening. Every private certifier has to be registered by a member state. Its status can be revoked. Member states can impose penalties on these certifiers. So member states, during the negotiation process, were able to incorporate a lot of veto points, a lot of control points on how certificates will be used in the EU. So just to recap, so what's the variance in our dependent variable? What are we trying to explain here? So we're trying to explain the move from the left-hand side, from the way currently things are being made, to the right-hand side, to the way things are being done in the emerging regime. What explains this change from the current to the emerging regime? So we answered the how question. We now understand how certificates are being used in the EU. Let's explain that. Let's answer the why question. Why did we get to this point? Why this change actually happened using the 3 hypotheses that we mentioned earlier. So to do the hypothesis testing and actual data analysis, I want to talk a little bit about how I classified my evidence. So each hypothesis reflects a different causal mechanism to explain, and I'm using a framework to assess whether an evidence or an observation from my data is certain or unique. This is a framework used by Vanevera. Each observation can pass one of these tests. For instance, on the upper left-hand side, an observation passes a hoop test if it's necessary but not sufficient to increase our confidence in this causal mechanism. For instance, if I'm trying to explain to what extent member state influence policy, I'm expecting to see at least some opposition by member state and suggestion to new policy design. So if I do not see that, I cannot start by explaining this causal mechanism. So this is a hoop test. Straw in the wind tests are tests that are not certain and not unique, but they allow me to build confidence. For instance, if owner of an evaluation laboratory tells me that member states want to keep private certifiers very, very controlled, this can reflect the general idea of what member states are about. So it doesn't directly relate to the causal mechanism, but it allows me to look for evidence in that way. And for the interest of time, I'll just present to you smoking gun tests, so evidence that were unique to the causal mechanisms I'm trying to explain. For instance, if I'm trying to explain how member state influence policy, I expect to see their interest in position paper turned into amendments in the agreed policy text. The exact interest turned into an amendment after the negotiation process. This provides me the link to reflect how they influenced this policy change. Okay, so for the first hypothesis, remember the first hypothesis was that everything is from a functional perspective point of view. So the expected causal mechanism, again, is that functional problems will create the pressure and need for integration in additional domains, and will design a policy regime that aims to solve previous integration problems. This is the causal mechanism I'm trying to explain here. So a few of my smoking gun tests, they came up with from interviews with ENISA, the cybersecurity agency representatives. The first observation, he told me that the current fragmentation was used to put pressure on public officials, industry, and private certifiers, pressured national policymakers to agree on the harmonized framework. So you see a functional problem of regulatory fragmentation, pushed decision makers to agree on the policy text. The second observation, he told me how in the policy process, the new suggested framework for certification was used to prevent the certification shopping based on differences of levels in the quality of certificates. We talked about this race to the bottom concern. So again, a functional problem of different quality of certificates was used to kind of fuel and drive forward the policy process. And thirdly, first-party certification was introduced. So this was under the umbrella of making the process more efficient. So we see in the new text, in the new policy, first-party certification for the first time. So a functional consideration helped us drive the change. But again, we see some functional solutions in the policy design. We talked about common standards, the peer review mechanism, the way that certifiers are now recognized across the EU, but also a lot of kind of counterintuitive policy decisions to the functional problems we described, right? Where do these national control points are coming from? Why previous paths for certification are still valid? These are all counterintuitive to the functional problems that this regime aims to solve. So there are significant aspects in the dependent variable that this hypothesis fails to present. And again, I'm showing you only a few of my observations, but I'll be happy to elaborate more on my observations in the Q&A or afterwards. Let's go to the second hypothesis and test for that. So the expected causal mechanism, we expect to see the Commission as a policy entrepreneur that pushes for further integration. It's going to prove integration solutions despite the reluctance of member states and design a policy regime according to its supranational aspirations. The first observation came up from an interview, views the EU Commission as really a change agent that drives things here. What the Commission was doing is putting on the table for member states both this certification framework and a proposal to strengthen ENISA, the cybersecurity agency, which is super valuable for member states. So the EU was maneuvering and manipulating member states to consider everything as a package. And this is what he told me. He told me that the Commission wanted to increase opportunity for success, so it moved in an area where member states did not agree before, certification, together with a proposal to strengthening ENISA. Right? So by putting two seemingly different things together, the Commission enhances the chances that member states will accept everything as a package. He explained to me that ENISA is weak to stand up against member states, but can still support and advise them. And national policymakers would not want to explain to their taxpayers why they did not agree on the strengthening of ENISA. So a very maybe smart political move by the Commission to push this proposal forward and increase its influence on this policy space. A second smoking gun observation is the fact that other solutions that were on the table, whether it be non-binding cybersecurity standards or turning the SOGIAS, the second path from the current regime to a mandatory framework, these were not even considered or negotiated with member states. The Commission brought up only a policy proposal that provides new type of authorities to its institutions. So the Commission is kind of framing what we're going to be, what is going to be discussed, highlighting its political motives in approving this. So if we quickly summarize this hypothesis, so we can increase our confidence that political moves by the Commission led to this policy change, but we do not see the causal mechanism that explain, again, the national veto points, the nationally oriented approach of this policy regime. We understand where the mandate for EU institutions is coming from, but again, some aspects of our dependent variable are left unexplained. Let's go to our third hypothesis. So the influence of powerful states from a theory called intergovernmentalism. So the expected causal mechanism is different. We expect powerful states to dominate national opposition and design a policy according to their interests and needs. The first smoking gun observation is exactly what I mentioned earlier. Most concerns of powerful states turn into council or parliament amendments to the policy. And they significantly change how this regime was designed. And an ENISA representative told me exactly that. The power shift, this is after negotiations. I talked to him again and told me that the power shift in the agreed text is toward member states. They get to control the Commission in every step of the way, enjoy discretion to act as they please, and retain full operational capacities in the aftermath of the proposal. So if we summarize this hypothesis, we finally see how it explains the chosen policy design with a lot of national control over the operation of certifiers. Powerful states acted as reactive agents to the Commission proposal to legitimize their influence in this policy space. What we see here is basically what I'm arguing, a Europeanization on demand framework. When I'm saying Europeanization, I mean turning policies to be decided at the EU level, and on the demand of who? The demand of national states. They decided the extent of EU policymaking that will actually happen here. This was launched based on market integration dynamics. Remember, we mentioned earlier market integration dynamics, but continued as a core state powers integration case. This is the case of both market and core state powers, but was designed eventually as a political compromise for the EU. And finally, I think we can now better understand the institutionally constrained use of certificates in the EU to cope with threats in the age of Internet of Things. And this really questions the realization of the full potential of this tool of governance. Okay, So I'm now going to provide a broad overview of a second case about U.S. Federal policymaking. So the idea here is to study U.S. federal policies as risk governance framework. If you think of the policy cycle of identifying the problem, deciding on policies and monitoring, it's very much close to the way we govern for risk, right? We assess the risk, estimate the hazard, implement risk management policies, and monitor and enforce what's happening. And this is what I was trying to do in this case. Look at 22 years of U.S. federal policymaking and understand how they actually govern cybersecurity risks for the private sector. And I'm asking first, how have U.S. federal policies constructed cyber risk governance frameworks in the past 22 years? Secondly, how these frameworks change across sectors. Are we governing all sectors on the economy equally, or are there changes in the way we govern those risks? And thirdly, how different framings and characterization of cyber risk really impacted the chosen policy path. To what extent the way these policies frame the problem actually link to the way they manage the risk. And I'm questioning this link. To what extent there is a link between the framing of the risk and the actual acts to manage it. My methodology is to systematically analyze text of 30 federal cybersecurity policies in the past 22 years, from which 463 sentences were extracted in two phases. The first was more of an inductive thematic analysis, so it did not come with predefined categories, but tried to identify the meaning in the texts. This yielded 7 mutually exclusive codes from these policies. And secondly, we're doing more of a deductive text analysis, coming with predefined categories about the early phases of risk governance from a book by Ertring Ren, to understand how policymakers frame the problem in these texts. So overall, 10 different categories to analyze public policies for cybersecurity. Let's go over the results. So the first regime is for critical infrastructures, and the framing of the risk there is the fact that it is unprecedented national risks. It's compared to risks from weapons of mass destruction, no less. The risk is serious and alarming, so policymakers are very serious in assessing the risk, but no hazard evidence is actually provided. The decision-making structure, so we see a shared public-private responsibility, so it's the private sector responsibility to protect itself. The government is more of kind of providing intelligence resources and helping the private sector, but not mandating almost whatsoever on what to do. So the government role is a role of facilitator, regulates only in specific sectors, and focuses on risk mitigation, on minimizing consequences after the harm. Coercive risk management steps were carefully applied, and again, based on industry input. If you trace how these policies operate over time, so on the vertical axis, you can see the number of key sentences in policy texts and then how they evolve over time. I'm highlighting here to what extent they talked about framing the risk and then conducting decision-making or deciding on the decision-making structure. So you see a lot of early framings of the risk in the 90s that continued pretty consistently in the following years, and also for the decision-making structure of shared public-private responsibility. This did not significantly change over the years. We see one punctuation point in 2013 that more or less resembles what we saw earlier. So this is a critical infrastructure cyber risk regime. A second regime is in health and finance. And here cybersecurity is a different problem. It's not a national security risk, it's a privacy problem. It's a data protection problem. We need to take care of personal data in these sectors. And we see a very different decision-making structure, a much more vertical, top-down, working with traditional regulators, paying high attention to monitoring and enforcement, right? This is what traditional regulators are doing. They're monitoring, they're enforcing the regulation. And coercive risk management steps were actually coded into these policy texts. So we see a lot of information security provisions in these policy texts from the 90s that maintained and still relevant today. Here, over time, I highlight to what extent we see risk reduction steps and monitoring and enforcement. This kind of dominates this risk regime. So a lot of the policies are occupied with monitoring and enforcing risk regulation and reducing risk in advance. This is in strong contrast to what we said earlier of framing and creating a shared decision-making structure for critical infrastructures. The third and final federal risk regime is for non-critical sectors. So these are all the companies in the broader digital economy. And here, cybersecurity is not a national security risk, it's not a privacy risk, but it's a constraint on the economy. Cybersecurity prevents investors from participating in the economy, and clear evidence is provided. They actually show us how it affects trade. But again, we see only market-based self-regulatory arrangement. Despite this alarming framing of the risk, the government is more of an enabler of private initiatives. Recently, it enjoys some monitoring and enforcement capacities through several agencies, but coercive risk management steps are only encouraged on a voluntary basis. If we trace this over time, we see risk framing started in the beginning and was pretty consistent over time, and the decision-making structure was decided early on as self-regulation and continued as is over time. So there you have it, 3 very different ways to govern cyber risks in the US economy at the federal level. So this is federal policymaking over the economy that varies significantly between these 3 sectors. If we conclude this case, we see that in light of the increasing sophistication of threat, this policy stagnation is an alarming pattern that needs to be better explained. We see how cybersecurity governance is not so much related to the nature of the problem, so rational calculations, but rather by the way we frame the risk in early phases of policy and development. Despite the perception of risk frames as having a direct consequences with how risk regulation operates, we found that their impact is quite limited and institutionally constrained. Okay, so we are ready, I hope, for takeaways from both of these cases. So I'm bringing back the puzzles from the first slide. Remember, so we asked how different policy arenas and processes yield risk governance outputs, and we see that in the EU, we saw this variance over time, how policy changed or actually did not really change over time. And in the US, we saw how this is happening across economic sectors. So how risk governance outputs vary across these different categories. And then we try to explain that. And the overarching argument is that the theory of historical institutionalism, of path dependency, this is a theory that is really useful to explain how the policy was institutionally constrained and preventing cybersecurity policies from fully utilizing their potential. Overall, we have uncovered some of the social and the political drivers for governing for cybersecurity, highlighting the importance of understanding cybersecurity from a socio-technical perspective. Okay, so we have a few minutes. I will share with you some of my current and future research steps. So first, in my postdoc, I became interested in policy compliance. So we worked so hard. We saw how hard we worked to design these policies, but to what extent actors actually comply with what we see? To what extent what I call the threat actors can actually comply with the policies we worked so hard to design? And I'm studying the advertising industry, the ad tech industry, and the fintech industry, using more technical methods of information collection. And I'll be happy to elaborate on that here and in future discussions. But I want to highlight here two projects that that I'm deriving from the second case study. So we saw a gap in the way cyber risks are governed, and I want to understand the role of private regulators. So cyber insurance, compliance, cyber insurers, compliance officers, what they do to fill the vacuum. This is the question. So the first project is about cyber insurance, and I view them as de facto risk regulators for the market. So I'm asking how and why insurance companies have institutionalized cyber risk managers for the client and de facto regulate the market. I'm doing a comparative analysis across different risk management strategies, how insurers assess the risk, prevent the risk, or mitigate a risk by minimizing the consequences after the harm. If you look at the literature on cyber insurance, it's mostly occupied with preconditions. So what do we need to create a wider adoption of cyber insurance by actors, kind of assuming that this will lead to better cyber resiliency, and I'm trying to question that. I want to see to what extent insurance companies actually create better cybersecurity. If you think about how insurance companies are regulated, they're mostly regulated for financial solvency, right? The regulator is not looking at how insurance companies actually manage the risk for their clients. And this is what I'm trying to highlight in this research project. It will be presented in the upcoming Cybersecurity Law and Policy Conference in the University of Minnesota. The second project is about compliance officer. So CISOs are Chief Information Security Officers. And recently, the New York Department of Financial Services required each financial company to appoint a CISO that will be accountable to the regulator, kind of changing the way regulation is working from a two-party system of rule maker and rule taker to a three-party system of a rule maker, rule taker, but rule intermediary in between. These CISOs kind of assist the regulator to improve the regulatory process. So I aim to conduct kind of a natural experiment between the health and the financial sectors in the US, and I'm comparing the way CISO are operating as rule takers for health industry, but as rule intermediaries for the financial industry. And my goal is to understand the levels of legitimacy, levels of authority, and discretion provided to CISOs in each organization, and better understand the regulatory processes over cybersecurity in the US economy. Thank you so much for your attention. That's all I have.
Great. Opportunity for questions, folks.
I'm managing that? Or
Sure, go ahead, please.
So on your U.S. case, you really drilled down to things like historical institutionalism as one of the driving mechanisms here.
Right.
But I'm wondering how approaches like punctuated equilibrium might also explain this, and then thinking to the graphic you had on the critical infrastructures,
Right.
where there was that sloping instance in policy mentions, but then a large spike in 2013.
Yes.
So did you come across anything in the documents or interviews that might suggest policy being more reactive in the cybersecurity space?
Right. So a great question, but using the punctuated equilibrium theory, right? So policy is usually stable, but then we see some spikes in the way policy is developed. And it's interesting because it usually is related to focusing events. In my case that I didn't show here about privacy risks and how the U.S. construct kind of a balance between privacy and national security, to what extent we see privacy oversight of the government surveillance. You see the role of these focusing events. We see a downgrade in privacy oversight after 9/11, for instance. We see upgrade in privacy oversight after Snowden, for instance. But here, punctuated equilibrium was not helpful for me to explain these spikes in policy. We yet to have kind of a cybersecurity Pearl Harbor kind of event, right? So, I hope it will not happen, but I think a focusing event in cybersecurity will really change things at a federal level. But I think the government now is more occupied in utilizing the expertise of private actors and provide mandatory regulations for a specific sector, think of chemistry, nuclear plants, but we are yet to see explanations for these spikes in policies like the punctuated equilibrium theory suggested.
In the European case study,
Yes.
I'm sort of abstracting a little bit that there's what you've described is essentially a kind of a more general case study of an environment where there's an expectation for federated governance with a relatively weak centralized oversight board. Did you see any best practices that could be taken away and applied in a more general sense in terms of how or where there are opportunities to strengthen the ability of the centralized authority to be able to enforce some kind of governance or certifications?
Mm-hmm. So thank you. I think the question is about whether the EU is a specific case of centralization of this policy arrangement, or whether this can findings travel to another example.
It's the extrapolation, which
Yeah.
is you've seen an example of a scenario, but that scenario is probably replicated in multiple other scenarios.
Yes.
So are there ways of what are the best practices that you could take away from what you learned
Mm-hmm.
that could be applied to improving other these and other situations?
Right. So I think the EU was brave in a way to try to address the problem of security in devices, because it's a very difficult problem. But what I think that drives the dynamics here and can be maybe applicable to other cases is the fact that when you think of cybersecurity issues, they started as state sovereignty issues, right, close to national security, critical infrastructures. The state was very interested in it was a kind of security policy thing, and gradually becomes a market issue. And you see that influence of the state sovereignty thinking on the way we're trying to regulate the market. And I think this is why we see policies that are not really utilizing their potential. And I think as you go along, you will see this in other nations as well. Israel just recently established a civic bureau for cybersecurity, taking away authorities from the national intelligence agencies. So cybersecurity is gradually becoming more and more economic, market-oriented problem, and traditional regulators of the market are becoming more involved. Think about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They're doing cybersecurity now as well. But you still see the influence of the national security apparatus on those policies over time. And maybe this is a framework we can take when analyzing cybersecurity in other cases.
One of the challenges of being in high school, by the way, I'm very, very excited about somebody looking at institutional level things, because we need to do that more. So don't hear what I'm saying as critiquing that at all. But we have folks here that look at, they're doing software. We have a lot of people that are really focused on the individual level. What does this mean for a person? How does it play out for a person?
Yeah.
And for many of them, the things you're describing, they go, well, that's just background. I can't do anything about that. It's out there.
Uh-huh.
I'd be curious, like, how would you describe what you're interested in and what you're working on so that it catches their attention? What kinds of things would you say if you were in the elevator and it got stuck in between the second and third floor in 10 minutes? It happens.
Yeah.
And you got some time with one of your colleagues who is really focused on the individual level of the technology to get them excited about following up that conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question that I'm wrestling with on an ongoing basis to try to make it more concrete, right? Why should we care about these institutional settings? At the end of the day, they don't really matter. Like this is the observation. And I think that what I was trying to show is that these are individuals who decide on that, right? They have certain risk perceptions and risk framings, and they design these policies at the end of the day. That's why it's a social technical problem. It's humans, the cognitive ability of us to process, frame, and produce policies. We're influenced by focusing events, we're influenced by many things. And I think at the end of the day, this maybe brings this finding more into the individual side of things. I think there's also a question of how the different actors interact, where the responsibilities of a state, economic actor, social actor, and or start. It's kind of a very difficult or a complex ecosystem to define these boundaries. And I think that those who are interested in software, the private sector is increasingly having more and more stakes in how this will happen. And you see now the move through using intermediaries, so cloud service providers, app stores. They have a lot of security weight on their hands because they decide for many users and individuals what will be security levels. And if you don't do this right, the state then needs to intervene. So I think by framing this as a problem across that triangle, it can help students understand and put this more into the context of what they are doing.
Go ahead.
Sure.
So just to bounce a little bit further on what Brian was saying, a lot of what people do here at the high school is involved with things like privacy, trust, information behavior. And so I'm curious then if you could put a spin on that at the institutional level, if you have found as these policies are being developed, anything that may relate to information avoidance, information adoption, information seeking behaviors that these institutions are practicing or using that are coming across in these documents.
Yeah, so how do we, so I think the question was how we relate to the way institutions process information, or how do we see any link between the institutions deal with the information, the actual policies they produce?
Right, so these institutions are getting information, whether it's from the national
Right.
states or from the
Yeah.
EU institutions,
Yeah.
and they need to come up with these policy documents.
Right.
So the information that they're receiving, are they actively seeking it out
Yes.
to get information?
Yeah.
Are they receiving information but putting it aside and saying, this isn't so important? How are they prioritizing
Yeah.
information and how that is then generated into policy documents?
Yes, I think this is a fascinating question. How these agencies that regulate gain institutional knowledge, maybe, how they are framing their problems in an institutional way. And I think for that, I need to get more intimate with how agency works. Like dive in maybe into one agency, the commission, and how it works, and who are the information change agents, who are the ones that provide information, who are the ones to act upon that information. I think this may be more of kind of an organizational spin to this study. I think that this is fascinating. I haven't done it yet. Yes.
I'm curious if you think about in terms of educating our undergraduates. One of the key things that are important for undergraduates to be taking away from this research, from what we're doing, and how might you be able to craft that or embed them into your teaching and help students understand these issues as they prepare to step into possibly their first professional job?
Yeah. So great question. So how this will be appealing for undergrads, right? I think what I'm trying to do here is to highlight an often neglected aspect of dealing with technology problems at the policymaking level, but applying kind of a regime approach. So I'm starting my unit of analysis, the policy problem, and then I've kind of working backwards to understand how did we get to this point, how it was governed. And my take on that, this can serve maybe as a complementary analytical observation for students when they go into this ecosystem, and maybe see government regulation as a given, or maybe see this as something that's not being too critical about how this is evolving, how it's being developed. And I think my way to show why this is applicable is to exactly highlight that, highlight the nuances of how policymakers work on those issues, and help students connect their work to the policymaking arena, studying the policy process. There's no literature, almost no literature in the public policy discipline about those issues yet, right? We know how climate change policy is working. We're less familiar with how policy process mediates policy outcomes, reduce technology risks. And I think students can benefit from highlighting this, and in this way can be better connected to what they're interested in, because policy systems, they're ecosystems of any system, right? Like the way you engineer software, or the way the industry is working. This is a third ecosystem, and you can use the same glasses and be critical about this system as well.
How would you help the students understand how that ties into the various information concepts that they've been learning throughout, in the rest of the program?
That's a
Because I've
great,
heard a lot of policy,
Yeah.
and so the information side.
that's a great question. I definitely need to think more about that. I think Sean's idea about institutional knowledge and how information is being translated to policy is maybe our route to go. I need to think more about that. It's a very good question.
I can ask a kind of practical, grounded question
Yes,
for someone
please.
relatively new to the space.
Yeah.
So, transnational supply chains for components.
Yeah.
Is there an articulation process of if it is certified in this country, it will be assumed to be certified in another country, especially if it's a larger assemblage?
Yeah.
And so that's the abstract question for the EU. The specific one is, right, so the US is on a bit of a mission for convincing some of our allies that Huawei products, components, and network infrastructure might be problematic for security reasons, and are trying to get them decertified.
Right.
We seem to be doing it at a nation state level, not at the commission level for the EU. So one, is there an articulation process? And two, are we doing the right strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not a coincidence that the EU is the first political entity to go into security devices. This is such a difficult problem. It's a supply chain problem. Can you certify each step of the supply chain process? I think what the EU is aiming for, at least to start with, is to show the world that this can work for very simple examples and products. We were under the assumption that security certification is solely either a private thing or it needs private expertise to get things done. But it became very politicized. For instance, a company in Israel was struggled to get certification in times of conflict in Israel. Political conflict in Israel led to member states decided we're not going to certify this company. Like unrelated problems at all. So I think the EU is not as mature as you ask. It's in a very initial stage of showing the world this can work. We can deploy a certification framework recognized across the EU for very simple products. And it will be interesting to see what will be the first products that will be certified. Because remember, this is only still on paper, right? We just recently agreed on this framework, and now it's on us to wait and see what will be the first products to be certified, which manufacturers or in which countries manufacturers will go to certification. This is a voluntary framework. Manufacturers don't have to use that, but they think it's good for business, so they will use that. I think this is exactly, taking cybersecurity issues out of their state sovereignty bucket to the market bucket. So we're in a very early stage of this process, and we have to wait and see how it copes with supply chain complexities. Absolutely.
So again, piggybacking off of Wayne's question there,
Yeah.
I'm thinking a little bit about if these EU cybersecurity policies built on other analogs or other documents they may have pulled from. I'm thinking of things like the Treaty of Bologna that allowed the European countries to then recognize their university's degrees. So if you had a degree in Germany, that would be given the equal accreditation and consideration in the UK, or I guess former UK now, or France, things like that. So were there other supranational certification standards that they perhaps pulled from, or that they could rely on? Does that matter that this is now a security context versus Bologna, which was an education context?
Yeah, I think it definitely matters because you see how the EU came with the first idea that significantly changed when it went through the policy process and the intervention of member states in this process. I'm not aware of a case that was very close to state sovereignty and became a market case to compare with. I think this is part of the challenging in researching that is we don't know what will be the causes of the effects that we see. So that's why we need I chose the process tracing methodology, kind of a deep dive, intimate knowledge in this one case study, and be very cautious in generalizing to other cases. The most I can do is do analytical generalizations of the frameworks of what is a certification regime, but it's not it's not a larger case study that I can go and say, okay, this is probably going to how this is how it will operate in different contexts. I'm not there yet in my research. I think I was first trying to gain more intimate knowledge, study these for the first time from a policy regime perspective, and then I can look at other cases and draw more comparative conclusions. But that's a good question to ask for sure. Yeah.
chance for a final question. I'll see if I pass you here. Let me go ahead and thank you very much. And he'll be with us over the course of the next 2 days. His schedule's full, but the opportunity, you can always join any faculty session. We're happy to have 2 or 3